Hi everyone. How's everyone's day? Mine was good, thanks. We finally did it. I ran out of costumes. For now. I'll come up with something for next week, but didn't work out today. I'm sorry, but I did get dressed up. I put a dress and makeup on. You didn't want to see me in my pajamas, and I didn't want you to see me in my pajamas. So, we've all come here together. I dressed up for it. So I'm going to do it's going to be a little bit short tonight. I'm reading the first chapter of The Bear and the Nightingale, which is just one of my favorites. It's the first book in the Winter Night trilogy by Catherine Arden. And pretty much whenever anyone asks me for fantasy recommendations, I try to wedge these books in there because they're just so good. So this first chapter has a little fairy tale in it, so I'm just going to read that to you. But first the inscription, because it's Pushkin. By the shore of the sea stands a green oak tree. Upon the tree is a golden chain, and day and night a learned cat walks around and around on the chain. Where he goes to the right, he sings a song. When he goes to the left, he tells a tale. A.S. Pushkin. Chapter 1. Frost. It was late winter in northern Rus, the air sullen with wet that was neither rain nor snow. The brilliant February landscape had given way to the dreary gray of March, and the household of Pyotr Vladimirovich were all sniffling from the damp and thin from 6 weeks fasting on black bread and fermented cabbage. But no one was thinking of chilblains or runny noses, or even, wistfully, of porridge and roast meats, for Dounia was to tell a story. That evening, the old lady sat in the best place for talking, in the kitchen, on the wooden bench beside the oven. The oven was a massive affair built of fired clay, taller than a man and large enough that all 4 of Pyotr Vladimirovich's children could have easily fit inside. The flat top served as a sleeping platform. Its innards cooked their food, heated their kitchen, and made steam baths for the sick. "What tale will you have tonight?" Dounia inquired, enjoyed the fire at her back. Pyotr's children sat before her, perched on stools. They all loved stories, even the second son, Sasha, who was a self-consciously devout child and would have insisted, had anyone asked him, that he preferred to pass the evening in prayer. But the church was cold, the sleet outside unrelenting. Sasha had thrust his head out of doors, gotten a face full of wet, and retired, vanquished, to a stool a little apart from the others, where he sat affecting an expression of pious indifference. The others set up a clamor on hearing Dunia's question. "Finish the falcon! Ivan the Grey Wolf! Firebird! Firebird!" Little Alyosha stood on his stool and waved his arms, the better to be heard over his bigger siblings, and Pyotr's boarhound raised its big, scarred head at the commotion. But before Dounia could answer, the outer door clattered open, and there came a roar from the storm without. A woman appeared in the doorway, shaking the wet from her long hair. Her face glowed with the chill, but she was thinner than ever. She was thinner than even her children. The fire cast shadows in the hollows of cheek and throat and temple. Her deep-set eyes threw back the firelight. She stooped and seized Alyosha in her arms. The child squealed in delight. "Mother!" he cried. "Matyushka!" Marina Ivanovna sank into her stool, drawing it nearer the blaze. Alyosha, still clasped in her arms, wound both fists around her braid. She trembled, though it was not obvious under her heavy clothes. "Pray the wretched you delivers tonight," she said. "Otherwise I fear we shall never see your father again. Are you telling stories, Dounia?" "If we might have quiet," said the old lady tartly. She had been Marina's nurse too, long ago. "I'll have a story," said Marina at once. Her tone was light, but her eyes were dark. Dounia gave her a sharp glance. The wind sobbed outside. "Tell the story of Frost, Dunyashka. Tell us of the Frost Demon, the Winter King Karachun. He is abroad tonight and angry at the thaw." Dounia hesitated. The elder children looked at each other. In Russian, Frost was called Marasco, the demon of winter. But long ago, the people called him Karachun, the death god. Under that name, he was king of black midwinter who came for bad children and froze them in the night. It was an ill-omened word and unlucky to speak while he held the land in his grip. Marina was holding her son very tightly. Alyosha squirmed and tugged his mother's braid. Very well, said Dounia after a moment's hesitation. I shall tell the story of Marasco, of his kindness and his cruelty. She put a slight emphasis on this name, the safe name that could not bring them ill luck. Marina smiled sardonically and untangled her son's hands. None of the others made any protest, though the story of Frost was an old tale and they had all heard it many times before. In Dounia's rich, precise voice, it could not fail to delight. In a certain princedom, began Dounia. She paused and fixed a quelling eye upon Alyosha, who was squealing like a bat and bouncing in his mother's arms. Hush, said Marina, and handed him the end of her braid again to play with. In a certain princedom, the old lady repeated with dignity, there lived a peasant who had a beautiful daughter. What's her name? Mumbled Alyosha. He was old enough to test the authenticity of fairy tales by seeking precise details from the tellers. Her name was Marfa, said the old lady, little Marfa, and she was beautiful as sunshine in June and brave and good-hearted besides. But Marfa had no mother. Her own had died when she was an infant. Although her father had remarried, Marfa was still as motherless as any orphan could be. For while Marfa's stepmother was quite a handsome woman, they say, she made delicious cakes, wove fine cloth, and brewed rich kvass, her heart was cold and cruel. She hated Marfa for the girl's beauty and goodness, favoring instead her own ugly, lazy daughter in all things. First the woman tried to make Marfa ugly, in turn, by giving her all the hardest work in the house, so that her hands would be twisted, her back bent, and her face lined. But Marfa was a strong girl, and perhaps possessed a bit of magic, for she did all her work uncomplainingly and went on growing lovelier and lovelier as the years passed. So the stepmother, seeing Alyosha's mouth open, Dounia added, Daria Nikolaevna was her name. Finding she could not make Marfa hard or ugly, schemed to rid herself of the girl once and for all. Thus, one day at midwinter, Daria turned to her husband and said, Husband, I believe it is time for our Marfa to be wed. Marfa was in the izba cooking pancakes. She looked at her stepmother with astonished joy, for the lady had never taken an interest in her, except to find fault. But her delight quickly turned to dismay. And I have just the husband for her. Load her into the sledge and take her into the forest. We shall wed her to Marasco, the lord of winter. Can any maiden ask for a finer or richer bridegroom? Why, he is master of the white snow, the black furs, and the silver frost. The husband, his name was Boris Borosovich, stared in horror at his wife. Boris loved his daughter, after all, and the cold embrace of the winter god is not for mortal maidens. But perhaps Daria had a bit of magic of her own, for her husband could refuse her nothing. Weeping, he loaded his daughter into the sledge, drove her deep into the forest, and left her at the foot of a fir tree. Long the girl sat alone, and she shivered and shook and grew colder and colder. At length she heard a great clattering and snapping. She looked up to behold Frost himself coming toward her, leaping among the trees and snapping his fingers. What did he look like? Olga demanded. Dounia shrugged. As to that, no two tellers agree. Some say he is naught but a cold, crackling breeze whispering among the firs. Others say he is an old man in a sledge with bright eyes and cold hands. Others say he is like a warrior in his prime, all robed in white, with weapons of ice. No one knows. But something came to Marfa as she sat there. An icy blast whipped around her face, and she grew colder than ever. And then the frost spoke to her in the voice of the winter wind and the falling snow. Are you quite warm, my beauty?" Marfa was a well-brought-up girl who bore her troubles uncomplainingly, and so she replied, "Quite warm, thank you, dear Lord Frost." At this the demon laughed, and as he did, the wind blew harder than ever. All the trees groaned above their heads. Frost asked again, "And now? Warm enough, sweetheart." Marfa, though she could barely speak from the cold, again replied, "Warm, I am warm, thank you." Now it was a storm that raged overhead. The wind howled and gnashed its teeth until poor Marfa was certain it would tear the skin from her bones. But Frost was not laughing now, and when he asked a third time, "Warm, my darling?" she answered, forcing the words between frozen lips as blackness danced before her eyes, "Yes, warm. I am warm, my Lord Frost." Then he was filled with admiration for her courage and took pity on her plight. He wrapped her in his old robe of blue brocade and laid her in his sledge. When he drove out of the forest and left the girl by her own front door, she was still wrapped in the magnificent robe and bore also a chest of gems and gold and silver ornaments. Marfa's father wept with joy to see the girl once more, but Daria and her daughter were furious to see Marfa so richly clad and radiant, with a prince's ransom at her side. So Daria turned to her husband and said, "Husband, quickly, take my daughter Liza up in your sledge. The gifts that Frost has given Marfa are nothing to what he will give my girl." Though in his heart Boris protested all this folly, he took Liza up in his sledge. The girl was wearing her finest gown and wrapped in heavy fur robes. Her father took her deep into the woods and left her beneath the same fir tree. Liza, in turn, sat a long time. She had begun to grow very cold, despite the furs, when at last Frost came through the trees, cracking his fingers and laughing to himself. He danced right up to Liza and breathed into her face, and his breath was the wind out of the north that freezes skin to bone. He smiled and asked, "Warm enough, darling?" Liza, shuddering, answered, "Of course not, you fool! Cannot you see I am near perished with cold?" The wind blew harder than ever, howling about them in great tearing gusts. Over the din he asked, "And now, quite warm?" The girl shrieked back, "But no, idiot! I am frozen! I have never been colder in my life! I am waiting for my bridegroom Frost, but the oaf hasn't come." Hearing this, Frost's eyes grew hard as adamant. He laid his fingers on her throat, leaned forward, and whispered into the girl's ear, "Warm now, my pigeon?" But the girl could not answer, for she had died when he touched her and lay frozen in the snow. At home, Daria waited, pacing back and forth. 2 chests of gold at least," she said, rubbing her hands. "A wedding dress of silk velvet and bridal blankets of the finest wool." Her husband said nothing. The shadows began to lengthen, and there was still no sign of her daughter. At length, Daria sent her husband to retrieve the girl, admonishing him to have care with the chests of treasure. But when Boris reached the tree where he had left his daughter that morning, there was no treasure at all, only the girl herself lying dead in the snow. With a heavy heart, the man lifted her in his arms and bore her back home. The mother ran out to meet them. "Liza," she called, "my love!" Then she saw the corpse of her child, huddled up in the bottom of the sledge. At that moment, the finger of Frost touched Daria's heart, too, and she fell dead on the spot. There was a small, appreciative silence. Then Olga spoke up plaintively. "But what happened to Marfa? Did she marry him, King Frost?" "Cold embrace indeed," Kolya muttered to no one in particular, grinning. Dounia gave him an austere look, but did not deign to reply. "Well, no, Olya," she said to the girl. "I shouldn't think so. What use does winter have for a mortal maiden? More likely she married a rich peasant, and brought him the largest dowry in all Rus." Olga looked ready to protest this unromantic conclusion, but Dounia had already risen with a creaking of bones, eager to retire. The top of the oven was large as a great bed, and the old and the young and the sick slept upon it. Dounia made her bed there with Alyosha. The others kissed their mother and slipped away. At last Marina herself rose. Despite her winter clothes, Dounia saw anew how thin she had grown, and it smote the old lady's heart. It will soon be spring, she comforted herself. The woods will turn green and the beasts give rich milk. I will make her pie with eggs and curds and pheasant, and the sun will make her well again. But the look in Marina's eyes filled the old nurse with foreboding. And that's that for this evening, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in. Goodbye.